Hi, I'm glad you could join me. This is Gary Zacharias, and you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm going back for another look at a book that I have done a couple of podcasts on in the past. I love this series. It's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Something, whatever it is, the PIG series, which is kind of funny. So they have a pig as their emblem on the front here. So politically Incorrect Guide to the Bible. It says, you think you know the Bible, but did you know recent archaeological discoveries confirm the historical accuracy of many Bible stories? The Bible made modern science possible. Biblical laws paved the way for democracy and limited government. The Bible promotes human freedom. The enemies of the Bible are enemies of true reason and tolerance. Well, those are kind of surprising things, huh? Well, I'd like to do the very first chapter, titled, Why Do the Heathens Rage? And I like the way the book is organized, too. It tells you at the very beginning the big picture of what they're going to talk about in the chapter. By the way, the author is Robert Hutchinson, so I'll let you know something about him. He's written on a lot of religious issues. He studied philosophy as an undergrad, moved to Israel to study Hebrew, got an MA in biblical studies from Fuller Theological Seminary. So he's got an interesting background. Anyway, the first chapter does what every chapter does. They give you a big picture idea. So this one starts off saying, contrary to what anti-religious secularists assert, far more lives have been snuffed out throughout history by faith-hating fanatics than by religious believers. So I think that's interesting to say. All right, so he starts with all of these people that are frothing against Christianity these days. It said Penn and Teller. Okay, so they've come out with some things. I say they, it's Penn that does all the talking. But they come out against the Bible, and they bring up biblical experts once in a while, like Michael Shermer, and to make their case against the Bible. And Shermer says, the more we learn about archaeology and history of biblical times, the more we realize that most of the stuff in the Bible is fiction. Huh. Then he said, these atheist assaults on the Bible are now commonplace in public schools, universities, the media, and even some elite seminaries. That's really sad, isn't it? Our younger kids who haven't really studied this kind of stuff are being hit with this, and they don't know. There's the professor up in the front, or the teacher, and he or she is the symbol of authority telling them this sort of stuff. Hutchinson said, it wouldn't be so bad to have these attacks on the Bible if they were really new, but it said they're just repeating allegations that have been around for 1,800 years. So I think that's something to keep in mind. People are not coming up with something new against the Bible. It's been said before, and there's certainly been plenty of good answers, but nobody wants to hear those. So they started off, they said the Bible wasn't exactly a raging bestseller when it was first published. A little bit after Jesus' death, said the Romans didn't like the Jews to begin with. They thought they were barbaric and primitive. By 70 A.D., they'd stomped Jerusalem and just scattered the Jews, put something like a million people to death. And then when Christianity came on the scene, that was viewed as even worse than Judaism. It was a bizarre cult. It was some kind of Jewish fanatic who had started it. He stirred up trouble, and then his followers were supposed to be meeting secretly, and they ate human flesh and drank human blood. That was the word that went around. And there were rumors of immorality and orgies. They would call each other brother and sister. How bizarre is that? Then it said their holy book. It said, wow. It said Romans weren't interested in the Christian Bible. It said a lot of people just saw them as the scriptures as just a ragtag collection of strange laws and folk tales and badly written letters and biographies. Didn't have great literary style. Didn't follow the rules of rhetoric. St. Augustine, the greatest theologian, of course, in the first century of Christianity, he was so put off by the Bible that he ignored it and Christianity for some time. Okay, so it said there have been all sorts of Christian apologists writing books by the dozens attempting to present rational answers to Bible difficulties. And here, I like this. He lists some of the ways that people have attacked the Bible, and there are plenty of good responses to these. And this book isn't going to cover all of them, but you might think about that sometime. If you have friends that challenge the Bible, there are plenty of good books that you can pick up that will present rational answers to these so-called difficulties. You can email me if you want a list of them sometime. gary.zacharias@gmail.com. Okay, so here's some of the things that Christian apologists have to deal with: alleged historical or scientific contradictions, historical inaccuracies, textual variants. Boy, Bart Ehrman's gotten big on that, textual variants. In other words, the manuscripts don't always say the same thing word for word, so he sees that as a huge problem. It's not, but this isn't the time to get into that. Apparent misquotations or erroneous citations of biblical texts by later authors and so on. He says, sometimes these inconsistencies and errors, he said, are really little more than misunderstanding by what people say when they say the Bible is inspired. Christians and Jews don't mean that the Bible was dictated by God the way Muhammad says the Quran was dictated. Even Christians who affirm the Bible is inerrant, meaning no errors, say, okay, it was written by limited, fallible human beings with a real historical context. They're speaking a human language with all sorts of limitations and things you have to think about, that they used particular literary forms and social conventions, and they had a particular worldview. So, in other words, if you're going to try to understand the Bible, you're going to have some patient study and analysis, and people don't like that these days. They don't want something that's going to take a little bit of work. They say, no, just give me 30 seconds, and we'll go with that. I'm right now working with a guy via email. We're going back and forth on Christianity, and he throws a verse out once in a while, and I try to give him context and to suggest some of these things as far as a more better perspective, I guess you'd say, and trying to figure out what it means. And he's back to just throwing a verse out, just throw it against the wall and let it stick. So, the other thing that Hutchinson says here is that sometimes these critics of the Bible, they take what people did, some ugly things that people did, and assume that's God's will. No, it's descriptive, not proscriptive. In other words, you've got people in the Bible that lie and kill and cheat and do all these things. It doesn't mean that's what God likes. So you've got to get that straightened out as well. He moves to the next section. He calls it the elites against the people. He said you got about almost 2 billion people on the planet that revere the Bible as the Word of God. It's been a source of all sorts of divine inspiration and moral guidance, and it's really the foundational book of the Western world. And he said most Christians and Jews, even though they may have differences among their denominations, but that the Bible has vital, often shocking and unusual truths that help us understand ourselves and our eternal destinies. But he said we've got this influential group of academic and government and media elites, and for them, the Bible's not the cornerstone. It's a source of evil. It's got superstition. It's got bad taste. Christopher Hitchens rips on it in a book called God Is Not Great, of course. He says, intelligent school children have been upsetting their teachers with innocent but unanswerable questions ever since Bible study was instituted. So that gives you a chance. He also says that, he used to have kind of like an isolated individual griping about the Bible and all in Christianity, but he says in the 60s and 70s, the secular fundamentalists took control of the media and many academic and government institutions. And I think he's right. Christians have lost the educational world. They've lost the media, the governmental institutions that are out there. It's so sad. So he said, you got most people in the U.S. have a traditional view of the Bible, but you got this minority of privileged elites that are hostile toward them. And he said, if you think I'm being too harsh, he said, consider the case of Robert Reich. Now, he was the former U.S. Labor Secretary during the Clinton administration. You know what he said? The greatest danger that we face in the 21st century? Now, think of the list of things that would be the most dangerous for us to face. Terrorism? No. Epidemic disease? No. Poverty or famine? No. War? No. What did Reich say the worst thing that we have to face, the greatest danger? Religious belief. He says this is Reich talking now, the underlying battle, he said the great conflict is going to be between modern civilization and anti-modernists. And guess who the anti-modernists are? Yeah, that's us, Christians. So he said terrorism will disrupt and destroy lives, but terrorism itself is not the only danger we face. So he says, these are the people we need to worry about. He said you've got American universities and newspapers full of neo-Marxists and all their espousing all sorts of beliefs. Timothy Shortle is a professor of sociology at City University of New York's Brooklyn College. Here's what he had to say. Religion without fanaticism is a logical impossibility. Oh, ouch. He says people have their minds trapped inside a mental prison. That's how he sees religion. He said these people are going to be susceptible to extreme forms of hatred and violence. He says faith is obsessive compulsive. Wow. Did you know that about yourself? He says religious adherents fail to recognize their limitations. He calls them moral retards. Now, isn't that something to actually use that word retard? That just makes me cringe to hear about that. He says they discriminate, exclude, and belittle. They make a virtue of closed-mindedness and virulent ignorance. They are an ugly, violent lot. So that's Dr. Shortell, Shortell. He's a professor of sociology. Is that bitter and angry or what? And, of course, not far behind him is Richard Dawkins. He said, if you oppose evolutionary dogma, he said that comes from an exceedingly retarded, primitive version of religion. He says that's an epidemic in the U.S. right now. Media beliefs. I can remember this one. In the early 1990s, there was a quote from the Washington Post that said that religious people were, quote, largely poor, uneducated, and easy to command. Oh, can I read that one again? This is the Washington Post. They were talking about religious people. They were, quote, largely poor, uneducated, and easy to command. Now, they withdrew that comment later, but you know very well that they withdrew it with a smirk on their face because they still believed that. So now the worldview is that watch out for these people that believe in this book, this Bible. What about terrorism that came along? Well, that just helped the secularists because they lumped Islamic terrorism with every other religious belief, including the Dalai Lama. And they said, well, it's all the same thing. So what are they implying? Mother Teresa is just as scary as Osama bin Laden was. Just she had different methods. Wow. Isn't that something? Okay, let me move on here. He has every once in a while the chapter is broken up with quotes and all. So here's just a section. The Bible in American History, Part 1. He has a quote here from Patrick Henry. The Bible is worth all other books which have ever been printed. George Washington. It's impossible to rightly govern the world without God and Bible. Wow. And then here's maybe my favorite, John Adams. Our Constitution was made only for moral and religious people. So great is my veneration of the Bible that the earlier my children begin to read, the more confident will be my hope that they will prove useful citizens in their country and respectful members of society. So he says, I venerate the Bible so much. I want my kids reading this, and it'll turn them into useful citizens. But that comment at the beginning, our Constitution is made only for moral and religious people. I mean, think about this. If you take the restraints away from people and suggest to them that there's no God, there's no point to life, do whatever you want, look out for number one, don't worry about other people, then you can't govern yourself. You're going to run amok. And he says our Constitution is made for moral and religious people, people who realize there were limits and dangers in trying to just run your own life. So I like what Adams had to say here. Well, the heart of this chapter is this next section. Religion, he says, is this the greatest danger to world peace? He says, think again. He said, we've been assured over and over with the death of God that we could set up a rational society, would make the world into a utopia. Well, what's happened when God has been taken out over the years? The French Revolution, how'd that turn out? Terrible. How about Nazism and communism? They got rid of God. How'd that work out? Terrible. He says far more lives have been snuffed out by faith-hating fanatics than by religious believers. And he goes through things like the Spanish Inquisition and the witch hunts and things like that. He said they don't compare at all. By the way, the statistics show that those two items, the Inquisition and witch hunts, that very small numbers of people died. And of course, it's terrible, no matter how many die. But he says it pales in comparison with what the secular fundamentalists have done. USSR, how many people did it kill under Stalin? 61 million. How about Communist China? 35 million. Mao's army, over 3 million. Nazi Germany, 20 million. And on and on and on. It says that doesn't include the people killed in the wars that these anti-Christian states started. Like 25 million soldiers died in World War II. He said there are people that get lined up against brick walls and shot just because they believe in God. He said this is done by these rational, more scientific social planners of Russia and China or other places, just awful. So it says war wasn't the most deadly evil to affect humanity in the 20th century. Government was, and not just any government, but atheistic government. He said, if you have a government that's freed of any kind of moral restraint, if they believe the ends justify the means, if they scoff at the idea that they would ever have to answer to a power higher than themselves, well, why wouldn't you do what you could? Carry out mass murder if it helps your scientific social aims. Yeah. So he ends the chapter by saying, it was the arrogant belief in the absolute power of the state. Of course, that's not what the Bible teaches, but it's that led to these horrors and these regimes. They felt that there were no moral limits whatsoever. And it's a reminder of what Dostoevsky said, if God is dead, all things are permitted. That's exactly right. You take God out of the picture there. If he's dead, do whatever you want, whatever you can get away with. So he says, a century of firsthand bloody experience with this rational atheism, he said, has proven that it's atheism, not the Bible or religious belief, that's the greatest danger to world peace. So I'll end on that. And again, this is a politically incorrect guide to the Bible. I like the whole series. They got some wonderful books in this series. But this is a good one. And still around, so I'm sure you could find a copy someplace. Well, thanks, and have a good rest of your day.